Croeso, Bob. Good evening and welcome everyone to this evening's lecture to be delivered by Dr. David Miles. David is an infectious disease immunologist who has worked mostly on diseases of childhood in Africa and the vaccinations that protect against them. His scientific research took him to the Gambia, Malawi, and South Africa. David now lives in London and tutors on the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine's online MSc course. His first popular science book, How Vaccines Work, was published in March of last year. It's a book that I've just put down and can highly recommend for its readability and general interest, despite being meticulously researched. A very impressive achievement indeed. In coming weeks, we may well see an anti-vaccine activist being offered a senior government position in the delivery of healthcare in the US. Sadly, I suspect that your book, David, and lecture could come at a more opportune time. David, we look forward very much to your lecture this evening. Over to you, please.
Okay, first of all, is that screen share working?
Yes, it is, David.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the intro, James. I suppose I'll just add to that to say that, as James says, my research background is in infectious disease immunology. That is how the immune system protects us from the microbes that cause disease, or pathogens as we call them, and how the vaccines that we take to protect us against them work, how they induce the immune memory that protects us from that disease. Now, vaccines have been in the news quite a lot recently with new COVID vaccines, RSV vaccines, and now there's vaccine campaigns for Mpox and Marburg going on in various parts of Africa, which probably lead you to think, with all that going on, why on earth am I here talking about whooping cough? It's not. It's not a disease that we see or hear about very often, and plenty of doctors never see a case of it. Well, the reason is that the history of the whooping cough vaccine is intimately tied into how we know how vaccines work, and also how a lot of people came to believe that vaccines don't work or are actively dangerous. It's a century of good science and bad, or maybe perhaps, hello? Ah, there we go. Maybe perhaps a little bit less than a century, because our story starts in 1932 when Pearl Kendrick got off a train in the city of Grand Rapids in Michigan. To give some context to that, Grand Rapids was, well, and still is, called the Furniture City because there was a whole furniture industry built up in the city in the late 19th, early 20th century, building furniture that was sold all over America and exported overseas. In that time, it became a boom town as people flocked to Grand Rapids for work. But in 1932, it was no longer a boom town. It had been hit very hard by the Depression. Nobody was buying furniture anymore. Those factories were standing empty, and the people that used to work on them were now living in slums. Kendrick's job was not to work in furniture factories. It was to set up a new lab for the Michigan State Department of Health, where she'd be testing milk samples and water samples to make sure they were safe and not too contaminated. It was important work, and it was a promotion because she just finished a doctorate in bacteriology. But it wasn't going to use the skills that she learned in that doctor while she was doing her doctorate. It was, as I say, as important as it wasn't something she could really get her teeth into. It was very routine work. And she wanted something to get her teeth into. And what she opted for was whooping cough. The problem was she didn't have any money to study whooping cough. When she asked her director about it, he replied, well, if you're having any fun with whooping cough, go ahead. But he couldn't offer her any money. It was the middle of the Depression. It was all a government department could do to keep the lights on. So her solution was to mobilize the entire city of Grand Rapids against whooping cough, starting with her laboratory team, which we can see her pictured with on the right-hand side there. Looking at the ages there, that picture is probably more 1940s than 1930s, but it does show, particularly show, I think it's worth pointing out Grace Eldering and Lonnie Gordon, who were both involved in this process from the very early stages. They worked their evenings and their weekends for years on end to try to do something about whooping cough. But whooping cough wasn't in the laboratory. It was out there in the slums of Grand Rapids. And to find it, she needed somebody doing outreach. The people that she got involved with that were local nurses who, again, worked their downtime unpaid to find children who had whooping cough initially, initially to find them so Kendrick and her team could collect samples. Later, they got involved with testing the vaccine that came out of this research. Now, all of this did cost money. Even though nobody was asking to be paid, running a laboratory is not free. You still need materials, and that money has to come from somewhere. And in Grand Rapids, it came from local businesses. Kendrick managed to get quite a lot of support from the local Chamber of Commerce, which, well, at this point, you're probably asking yourself why in a city where everybody was struggling to make ends meet and just to keep their heads above water. Why were so many people willing to give up time and money to Kendrick's personal project to do with whooping cough? Well, part of that answer, I think, comes from something Grace Eldering wrote years later, where she wrote, "We learned about the disease and the depression at the same time. Our watchword became round to the back and up the stairs. We collected specimens by the light of kerosene lamps from whooping, vomiting, strangling children. We saw what the disease can do." And those whooping, vomiting, strangling children were the reason why so many people were willing to give up so much time and money that they really didn't have when Kendrick said she might be able to do something about it. But to fully understand that, let's take a moment to talk about what we really mean when we talk about whooping cough. It's a disease caused by this bacterium, Bordetella pertussis, and it's carried by respiratory droplets. That is, whenever we breathe out a fine mist, a mist of very fine droplets. A lot of them are so small that they can stay suspended in the air for minutes or hours at a time, which means in any indoor public space, we are breathing in a cloud of each other's respiratory droplets all the time. And those respiratory droplets carry microbes. Now, most of the time, that's nothing to worry too much about. We have a thriving community of microbes of various sorts living in our respiratory tracts. That is all the way from our noses and our throats all the way down to our lungs. Sharing that around's no bad thing. More diversity in that community is usually a good thing. But it does offer a good way for pathogens, the microbes that cause disease, to get around. And one of those pathogens is Bordetella pertussis. In fact, Bordetella pertussis is one of the most infectious of the infectious diseases. It's only really matched by measles, chickenpox, and the latest variants of COVID-19, which are all carried around by respiratory droplets. It's a very efficient way for a microbe to infect somebody because, well, after all, we can't stop breathing. And that also explains why Eldering rather was talking specifically about whooping, vomiting, strangling children. It's not because whooping cough can't infect adults. It can. It's simply because in Kendrick and Eldering's time, it was very difficult to get through childhood without being infected by whooping cough. In fact, the only people who were making it to adulthood without being infected were people living in very isolated communities, usually on small islands. Grand Rapids was certainly not an isolated community. Consequently, it was seen as a disease of childhood. So what happens when it infects a child? Well, it will attach itself to the child's throat, and these bacterial cells will then start dividing. One cell will split into two, two become four, four become eight, and so on. For the first week, our child won't know that anything's going on. They'll still be running around, playing with their friends, going to school, doing what children do, and all the time they're breathing a mist of aerosolized droplets laden with Bordetella pertussis all over everybody they meet. No wonder it's so infectious. They'll start to get ill after about a week, when they'll develop a fever, maybe a bit of a cough. It'll look like they're getting a cold. It doesn't turn really nasty until the third week of infection. At that point, that's when the disease enters the paroxysmal stage. So called because the child is beset by paroxysms of coughing, in which one cough follows another, follows another, follows another, so rapidly that while the child is coughing, the child can't breathe. In fact, that's the reason it's called whooping cough, because when the coughing ends, there is this whooping gasping sound as the child's desperately trying to get air into their lungs and oxygen into their bloodstream. That's the strangling that Grace Eldering was talking about. Now, of course, they may not reach that stage. It's not unknown for children to pass out simply because of lack of oxygen or to have neurological injuries caused by brain cells dying, again, simply because of a lack of oxygen. And in Kendrick and Eldering's time and Gordon's time, about one child in 50 would die of whooping cough who got complications of their lungs. Now, when I say one child of 50 had a death rate of one child in 50 who got whooping cough, I really do mean one child in 50 at that point. Because as I said, it was practically impossible for a child who was anywhere but a very isolated community to not get whooping cough. I'd like you to take a minute to think about what that means. 2 school classrooms today, think about that. You're thinking about at least 50, probably more than 50 children. One of those children would not make it to adulthood if whooping cough was still as rampant now as it was in the 1930s, or indeed for centuries before that. That's how serious an issue it was. Now, an odd feature of the whooping cough infection is that by the time the child enters the paroxysmal stage, their immune system is beginning to clear the bacterium out of their airways. In fact, the immune system will have kicked in immediately they were infected, and within maybe 3 weeks of the paroxysmal stage, they will have no whooping cough bacterium in their system. I should say, please take all the timings I'm giving here with a heavy dose of approximation. It does vary a lot from one individual to another. That means they're past the danger point. They will probably, if they haven't got a neurological injury and they're still alive at that point, they probably will recover from whooping cough, but it will take time, a lot of time. It goes on for months. In Mandarin and Japanese and Korean, it's called the 100-day cough, which gives you a sense of just how long this goes on for, which does raise the question, if the cough is lasting for 100 days, give or take a large margin, and the bacterium's cleared out after 3 or 4 weeks. Well, how on earth is this bacterium making a child cough, making these children so ill without even being present in their bodies? Well, 10 years ago, there was a paper by some of the leading experts on whooping cough, which contained the line, "We still don't know why infection makes people cough!" Exclamation mark. Now, if you've ever read any scientific papers, you'll know nobody puts in an exclamation mark unless they're really, really frustrated. And the authors of that paper were really frustrated because 100 years on from the discovery that this bacterium causes whooping cough, and 10 years on from that paper, we're still no closer to understanding the mechanism behind the coughing. It's an unresolved question. We do know the bacterium causes the cough because it's such a characteristic cough that you only get caused by Bordetella pertussis. Our child will recover from the whooping cough after those weeks and months, assuming that they're still alive, and they'll be left with partial immune memory. Now, immune memory is the mechanism by which our immune system remembers microbes we've been infected with before, and it brings on a much faster and more effective immune response when we encounter them again. Sometimes the immune memory is so effective that we can never be infected with that microbe again. For example, with measles, if you've been infected with measles or vaccinated against measles, the chances are your immune system will protect you from will prevent the virus from even infecting you again. It doesn't work that way with whooping cough. The immune memory is partial. It protects for several years, but we are all repeatedly infected with Bordetella pertussis, roughly every 10 years, although again, take that as give or take a few years on either side of that. Most of the time, we won't know we're infected with it. It will colonize our throat. We'll be walking around with it for maybe a couple of weeks, infecting everybody we meet, well, at least breathing it all over everybody we meet. We probably won't get symptoms, or if we do, they'll be fairly mild symptoms. So we won't know we've been infected, but it is something that just happens to us repeatedly. And it does mean that we will, in fact, never be free of Bordetella pertussis, short of some major breakthrough in medical technology, which is not really on the cards at the moment. It's always circulating in the community. Now, the outlook for a child today, the outlook for a child infected with it is not as bleak as it was back in the 1930s. Antibiotics are pretty effective at killing the bacterium, which is effective at stopping children from dying and stopping them from getting neurological injuries. It doesn't shorten the 100-day cough or that those weeks and months of suffering from paroxysmal coughing, because as we know, one thing we do know is that that cough is not being driven by the presence of the bacteria in the child's system. Simply removing it from the child's system does not put an end to the cough. Um, that just has to play out in its own time, which limits the effectiveness of modern medicine for dealing with it. Though, yes, it does keep children alive, which is always nice. Coming back to Kendrick, she, as I said, wanted to do something about whooping cough, and her solution was to come up with a vaccine against it. Now, she knew fundamentally how vaccines work. A vaccine is a mechanism for inducing that immune memory that protects us from a microbe without causing the disease that the microbe causes. The simplest way of turning a microbe into a vaccine is to kill it. The immune system responds primarily to the different types of protein molecules. If you killed Bordetella, well, you've got all the protein molecules right there, but the bacterium's dead. It can't cause disease if it's dead. It seems very straightforward. Of course, as a principle, it is straightforward. Putting it into practice is difficult, partly because simply killing the microbe just does not work for every type of microbe. Every microbe needs a bespoke approach to vaccination. And in Kendrick's time, Kendrick was not the first person to try this with whooping cough. Many people had tried before her, and many had failed. Because, in fact, the process of isolating, culturing, killing, testing a microbe is not straightforward. It's difficult. And there's a lot of ways of getting it wrong. And I'd like to take a moment to step back here and consider how Hollywood actually has poisoned our minds when it comes to how science is done. Because if this was a Hollywood film, Kendrick would be some sort of intuitive genius, probably played by Jeff Goldblum, who would walk into the room, sum up the situation at a glance, and pull a brilliant idea off the top of her head. Meanwhile, all the rest of her team, particularly Grace Eldring and Lonnie Gordon, would be standing around shaking their heads and saying, oh, no, no, that'll never work. Because Hollywood teaches us that to be a scientist, you either have to be an intuitive genius who looks like Jeff Goldblum, or you have to be some fuddy-duddy who can't understand intuitive genius when you see it. That's of course, not how science works. When somebody believes they've come up with a brilliant solution after one glance at the problem, well, that is the last person you should be listening to. Kendrick certainly didn't do that. Her approach was meticulous. And here we can see her in action, being meticulous. Now, this is clearly a posed shot because no working laboratory bench was ever that tidy in the history of working laboratory benches. But it gives an idea of how she went about this process. When I talk about vaccine development now, you're probably thinking about big university laboratories and pharmaceutical companies. Yeah, that's pretty accurate to vaccine development in the 2020s. In the 1930s, it really did look a lot more like this. It was going to be somebody working at a bench in a hospital or a State Department lab, trying to come up with a solution to a local disease outbreak. The scientists doing this brought different levels of understanding and skills to what they were doing. None of them really were more skilled than Kendrick. She was absolutely meticulous. And Eldering and Gordon and the rest of her team were not standing around shaking their heads being fuddy-duddies. They were contributing ideas, pointing out things that Kendrick had missed. This was very much a collaborative effort that was going on here. And they tested and they improved pretty much every step of the process. How to isolate the bacteria, how to culture it, how to kill it, which was a difficult process back then. And they tested every batch of vaccine by injecting it into a rabbit. This sort of quality control sounds fairly obvious now, and it's not glamorous. We only really hear about it when it goes wrong. But in those days, it was actually unusual for vaccines to be tested properly when people were making them in this fairly artisanal way that we see here. Now, at the point where Kendrick found that she had a way of consistently inducing an immune response in a rabbit. She had good reason to think that she had a working vaccine. Now, at this point, a lot of her contemporaries would simply have gone out and injected this vaccine into small children and hope for the best. That was a lot of vaccines were used without being properly tested, and that really went about the way you would expect it to go a lot of the time. Kendrick did not do that. She was as meticulous about testing as she was about everything else. But her problem was, how was she going to test it? Today, we have a playbook for how we test new vaccines and treatments, but that playbook wasn't written in the 1930s. Scientists doing this sort of thing had to work it out as they went along. Well, Kendrick's first idea was based on the fact that most of the children getting whooping cough were living in slums in fairly large families, and often several families to a slum. That meant when one child had whooping cough, there were a lot of other children in that slum who had not been who were exposed to it. So she thought if they went and vaccinated those exposed children and they didn't get whooping cough, that would prove whether the vaccine worked. That idea was scuppered by the fact that nobody was being paid to do this. It simply took too long for nurses to find the time to get out to these slums and find children with whooping cough and then get word back to the laboratory, and then for somebody from the laboratory to go out with a vaccine. By the time they got there, all those exposed children already had whooping cough. Kendrick had to go back to the drawing board. Fortunately, why do I say fortunately? Well, because Kendrick did not know about that 1 week period between children being infected and developing symptoms. And she did not know that during that period, their immune memory, or rather their immune system, was already being induced against whooping cough. Giving them a vaccine that's intended to induce the immune system, given at that point, just won't do anything. It won't add anything to what's already going on. For the vaccine to work, it had to be given to children before they were exposed to whooping cough. If she'd been a bit quicker off the mark and she'd vaccinated those children who were already infected, she would have concluded that the vaccine didn't work. It would have been a disaster because we now know it did work. Now, I mention this because this is the only example I've ever run across of a study being saved from a disaster like that by its lack of funding. Kendrick went back to the drawing board and she came up with an idea that's actually pretty similar to the way we test vaccines today. She vaccinated some children in Grand Rapids, and then for each vaccinated child, she identified a control who lived in the same part of the city, same age and same sex. And then they monitored them to see who got whooping cough and who didn't. In 1937, after 5 years of working around the clock, evenings, weekends, and whatever other time they could spend on it, Kendrick and her team had an answer. Children who had been vaccinated were 1/7 as likely to get whooping cough as children who were not vaccinated. Now, compared to some of the refinements made to this vaccine later, 1/7 doesn't sound particularly impressive. But in 1937, this was game-changing. Bearing in mind, nobody had any treatment or prevention approach to whooping cough at that point. And better still, the vaccinated children who did get whooping cough, those breakthrough infections, as we call them, simply weren't very serious. Yes, the children were getting whooping cough. Yes, they were getting the paroxysmal cough, but they weren't dying and they weren't getting neurological injuries. The vaccine worked. And perhaps equally importantly, was the fact the vaccine was relatively straightforward to produce. When Kendrick published what she called the Michigan method for producing it, it was something that anybody with a bacteriology laboratory could do. It could be scaled up fairly quickly. But before that was going to happen, she had to persuade the world that she had a working vaccine. And when I say the world, I really mean this man, Wade Hampton Frost. He started out by studying medicine. He then studied epidemiology. And by 1937, he was a professor at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, which was and still is one of the world's leading medical research centers. He was also the chairman of the American Public Health Association. He was a pillar of the American medical establishment in a way that a woman who worked in a State Department lab in some backwater city that he'd probably never heard of emphatically was not. And when he heard that Kendrick was claiming to have come up with a working vaccine against whooping cough, he was initially dubious. Now, that often gets him cast as rather the villain of this story, or at least one of those fuddy-duddies who can't understand that Jeff Goldblum's an intuitive genius, which I think is a little bit unfair. Given that several people had tried and failed to come up with a whooping cough vaccine, he was right not to take this claim on trust. And further to that, Depression era America was the golden age of quackery. You had all sorts of people coming up with all sorts of concoctions that they claimed to claim to cure or prevent all sorts of diseases, and a lot of them were calling those concoctions vaccines. When Frost wanted to know more, he was asking the right questions. And more importantly, he was willing to listen to the answers, which was not a straightforward thing for him to do, because it meant he had to look at Kendrick's data. Now, I've recently been working on a project with a student in Zambia, and if she wants me to look at her data, she can email it to me, or we can set up a Zoom call and she can share her screen and we can both look at the same data set. It's straightforward. In 1937, Kendrick's data was a pile of papers in a filing cabinet in Grand Rapids, and if Frost wanted to see it, he had to get on a train and go to Grand Rapids, which he can't really have relished that idea because Frost was not a well man. Depending on what source you look at, he either had advanced tuberculosis or esophageal cancer. It's unclear which, but he certainly can't have relished spending a couple of days taking the train from Baltimore to Grand Rapids, being banged around and breathing coal smoke, but he did it. In fact, he did it twice. And when he saw what Kendrick was doing and what she'd done, he became a great supporter of hers. He arranged for a statistician to go and spend time with her and make sure that when she published her results, they were absolutely watertight. He also supported the rollout of the vaccine across the United States before the paper was published. In fact, the paper wasn't published until 1939. Frost didn't live to see that. He died the year before. It was, in fact, his support of Kendrick was one of the last acts in an illustrious career. And by that time, a lot of American children were getting whooping cough vaccine, and far fewer of them were getting whooping cough as a result. Now, I say American children because at this point, it was only American children. There's a couple of reasons for that. Partly the world's medical professions were just not as joined up then as they are now. And of course, a lot of the rest of the world was rather distracted for a few years after 1939. But this is where the story comes a bit closer to home. And it's picked up by the Medical Research Council, which is the organization by which the British government funds and occasionally organizes medical research, which was it's still around. It's been through a few changes since then, but it's still called the Medical Research Council. Whooping cough was as big a problem in Britain as in the United States. And in 1942, the Medical Research Council arranged a series of trials of candidate whooping cough vaccines made in Britain, none of which worked. Not a good start. But meanwhile, the MRC was writing that playbook on how we test vaccines and treatments. And I'm going to take a bit of a digression here because a key moment was a trial of a fungal extract called patulin, which it was believed might cure the common cold. This caused a problem for the MRC scientists testing it because there's no objective measure for how serious a cold is. When you're assessing somebody's cold, a very important question is simply, how are you feeling today? And this is where we run into the placebo effect, which was beginning to become understood at that point. If you know you've had something that you told might be a treatment for your cold, you might just feel a bit better because the power of suggestion, the placebo effect. And that power of suggestion might come from the person asking you how you feel. A question of if you're asking somebody how they feel and you know they've been treated, you might say, "Oh, nice to see you feeling a bit better today. Let's rate that, shall we?" As opposed to, "Oh, I'm sorry to see you looking so ill. Let's put a rating to that, shall we?" Those are two ways of phrasing things that can come up with different answers. So the MRC scientists the MRC scientists came up with the double-blind placebo-controlled trial. Placebo-controlled because people who did not get Patulin got a dummy treatment that was indistinguishable from Patulin. Double-blind because neither that person nor anybody asking them how they feel knew which was which. It was, as far as possible, taking the subjectivity out of this process. This happened in 1943. It was the most rigorously conducted clinical trial ever at that time, and it proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Patulin has no effect at all on the common cold. Good trial, bad treatment. In 1946, the MRC decided to have another go at whooping cough. And their 1946 trials are a very important moment in vaccine science, good vaccine science, for two reasons. First of all, as well as including several candidate vaccines made in Britain, they also included Michigan method vaccine. Actually, they got Kendrick to send vials that she'd made up herself rather than making up vials in Britain, which they could have done. And they used the double-blind placebo-controlled method to test the vaccine. Now, I'm going to ask you to indulge me for a minute. I'm not going to ask you to read anything on that table. This is purely for my benefit, because when you spend as much time as I do looking at reading decades old papers, then table 12 of a rather bland 20-page paper is massively exciting when it shows you the first vaccine to be proved to be safe and effective by the double-blind placebo-controlled method. And that vaccine was Kendrick's Michigan method whooping cough vaccine. There were several other British vaccines in the same trial, none of which worked, which, thanks to the rigorous methodology, the scientists were able to say definitively state those vaccines don't work. Now, based on the data from those 1946 trials, many countries started to make and to roll out the Michigan method vaccine. Countries across Europe and Latin America in particular, but it gradually spread across most high and middle income countries. But not Britain, even though it was the British data that was being used to underpin those rollouts. Here's where we run into the anti-vaccine movement for the first time, or anti-vaccine sentiment at any rate. Now, when I say anti-vaccine, you're probably thinking about social media posts written with great feeling and bad spelling, or people marching up and down Oxford High Street waving placards. It's always Oxford, isn't it? But the point is, you're probably thinking about a mass movement, a popular movement. That's not how it was in the late 40s, early 50s. At that point, anti-vaccine sentiment was coming mostly from British doctors, from within the British medical profession. There were a lot of doctors who simply distrusted vaccines and were very resistant to a new vaccine being rolled out. There were many doctors and many scientists who opposed that view and advocated very strongly for the whooping cough vaccine to be rolled out. And the MRC's solution was to run another set of trials in 1951, which again proved that Kendrick's Michigan method vaccine was safe and effective. By this time, it had gone into tens of thousands of children under very strictly controlled conditions. Whooping cough vaccine was finally rolled out in Britain in 1957. Now, I'm not going to throw too many figures at you this evening, but I think these figures are quite instructive because we have pretty good data on whooping cough deaths and cases in England and Wales going back to 1940. And if you look at that left-hand graph, you can see the number of deaths in England and Wales, which was followed in Scotland and Northern Ireland. It's just not captured in this data set. But you can see the number of deaths falling steadily through the 1940s and 1950s. If you look at the middle graph you can see that's not because there was any shortage of whooping cough cases. There were as many cases going on then as there ever had been, if not more. That was probably because antibiotics were becoming available at that point, and of course the NHS was inaugurated in 1947 and making sure those antibiotics were going to the children that got them. If you remember, I said antibiotics will stop children from dying of whooping cough, even though they won't shorten the cough. The vaccine was then rolled out in 1957, and we can immediately see cases and deaths both fall off a cliff immediately. I've actually had to break the axis of the whooping cough deaths graph because otherwise you wouldn't be able to see what was going on. In 1957 or 1956, the year before the vaccine was rolled out, there were 92 deaths, which was a historic low. In 1958, The year after the vaccine was rolled out, that was down to 27. And that was the highest level. They've never been 27, that many deaths in England and Wales since then. And we can, oh, excuse me, beg your pardon. I'm doing a bit of coughing myself there, but without the whooping. Anyway, you can see the number of cases and deaths continue to fall steadily through the 1960s and 1970s until we get to 1977, when if you look at the middle plot with whooping cough cases, you can see there was a sudden outbreak of whooping cough that lasted from, actually that first outbreak lasted 77 to 79. 115,000 cases and 38 deaths, which don't show up too well on the death graph because they're spread over 3 years. But that was still a much higher death rate than we'd seen from whooping cough in the years before that. Now, that would have been a fairly quiet year back in the 1940s, but this wasn't the 1940s. This was the 1970s. Whooping cough belonged to the era of air raid sirens and steam locomotives. So why on earth was it killing children again? Well, if you look at the right-hand graph, you get an idea of that. We started getting data on vaccine coverage rates started being collected in the 1960s and was up to about 80% by then. And then suddenly in the mid 1970s, by about 1975, 1976, it's dropped abruptly down to 30%. Suddenly there were large numbers of children who were not vaccinated against whooping cough. So it shouldn't have surprised anybody that whooping cough came back. And we can see that after that first outbreak of 77 to 79, there were actually several other very bad years during the 1980s. Meanwhile, vaccine coverage was picking up again. It got over 90% by the mid 90s, and it's still over 90%, although it is falling off steadily. And we have seen whooping cough come back to an unpleasant degree this year. I'm not going to talk too much about that in the talk, but we can get into that in the questions if you like. Because this is where we get to the bad science part of our story. The thing that if we ask the question, what caused that fall off in vaccine rates, the answer is this man, John Wilson. He was a pediatric neurologist, that is a doctor who looks at developmental problems usually involved with the brain. He worked at Great Ormond Street Hospital, which is one of the premier medical establishments in Britain. He was a co-founder of the British Paediatric Neurology Association, which made him a pillar of the British medical establishment in the same way that Frost had been a pillar of the American medical establishment 40 years earlier. And in 1973, in 1973, he told the Royal Society of Medicine that he'd seen 50 vaccine-damaged children, that is, children whose neurological conditions that put them in his clinic had been caused by the whooping cough vaccine. The medical establishment sat up and paid attention. This didn't come from nowhere. There had been reports of individual cases of children whose neurological problems may or may not have been caused by the whooping cough vaccine for at least 25 years by then. But nobody stood up and said they'd seen 50 children in one clinic. This made it sound like it was a lot worse than anyone had thought. It was controversial. There were a lot of doctors arguing that these neurological problems were not, in fact, caused by the whooping cough vaccine. And there's a good reason to make that argument, because a lot of these disorders, and I should say we're talking mostly about learning disabilities and epilepsy here. There were a few other neurological problems, but those are the main ones. A lot of them are going to present for the first time at about the same time that the child is going to get the whooping cough vaccine in their first year of life. They may get their first epileptic seizure then, or the developmental delays at the first indication of a learning disability may appear at that point. So by chance, you're going to expect some of these problems to appear immediately after receiving the whooping cough vaccine, or any other event that you care to choose in that child's life. You're going to see some of these problems appear within 2 weeks of the child's first birthday. But in itself, that doesn't prove that the child's first birthday cake caused them to develop epilepsy. Wilson, however, was convinced that this coincidence of timing was proof the whooping cough vaccine caused developmental problems. And he took the debate to somewhere it hadn't been before, because so far this debate had gone on mostly in scientific or medical conferences or letters to scientific journals. Most of the public were not aware that it was even going on. Wilson went public. He went on This Week, which was ITV's flagship documentary, and he said he'd seen 80 vaccine damaged children in his clinic. It's never a good sign when somebody isn't sure how many vaccine damaged children they've seen. Now, I'm told that I should probably explain to some of the younger members of the audience that in 1973 there were only 3 television channels, and everybody had to organize their evenings around what they wanted to watch on television. Now, sometimes I explain this, and I think some of the people I've said this to find it the most remarkable part of this whole presentation. However, it was the way things worked, and one effect of that was it meant that a substantial percentage of the entire population were tuned in and watching Wilson talking about 80 vaccine damaged children. And they certainly weren't hearing anybody asking, well, hang on, where do you find 30 children from in the last few weeks? In fact, Wilson didn't really explain that until the following year when he published a paper describing 36 vaccine damaged children. By this time, he'd apparently lost 44 children somewhere. Again, the paper simply said these were neurological problems that appeared within 2 weeks of having received the whooping cough vaccine. This is what we call a case series. That is a pattern that's identified by a doctor or a group of doctors or medical practitioners of some sort that is often indicative of some sort of problem that maybe we should be paying more attention to. Case series are important. They often are the first indication of a new disease or a new problem with a medication. What they do not do, what Wilson did not do, was prove that whooping cough vaccines were causing these neurological conditions, because to do that, you would have to do epidemiology. You would have to say, are these conditions more likely in vaccinated than in unvaccinated children? You could also find ways of looking at clustering in time. Are they more likely to appear immediately after a whooping cough vaccination than at any other time in the child's development? Wilson didn't do any of those. In fact, it wasn't until years later that it emerged exactly what Wilson did. What he did was send a couple of trainees to the hospital's records and tell them to find every case of a child whose neurological problem appeared within 2 weeks of getting a whooping cough vaccine and put them on his desk. He didn't look at unvaccinated children at all. He didn't look at children children who had been vaccinated long after they'd received the whooping cough vaccine, or of course the very large number of children who had the whooping cough vaccine and had not developed a neurological problem. What Wilson had proved was if you tell trainees to find records that meet a certain set of criteria and put them on your desk, they will go and find those records and they will put them on your desk. Mostly. It later emerged that 2 of those 36 children had never actually received the whooping cough vaccine, but they found their way into the data set anyway. This is what I meant when I talked about bad science earlier on. And I should say, I've spoken to some of Wilson's detractors, and they were pretty confident that he was a good doctor and a well-intentioned man who genuinely thought he was flagging up a serious health problem. He just wasn't a very good scientist, but really it didn't matter. When a senior doctor says things like that, people pay attention and parents stop taking their children to vaccine clinics, which led to that 115,000 cases of whooping cough I talked about earlier. In the first outbreak from 77 to 79. Of course, there were many more across the 80s in unvaccinated children. And not only in Britain. This scare spread to America, and as things tend to do, when something becomes a major cultural issue in the United States, it spread around the world. It also became the spur to several large-scale epidemiology studies that asked the sort of questions I was talking about, comparing vaccinated with unvaccinated children and looking for clustering in time. I was able to find 4 of those large-scale studies done in the USA, 2 in Britain, 1 in Denmark. Between them, they looked at over 1 million children, and they all came up with the same answer. There simply is no connection between whooping cough vaccines and neurological disorders. And that's why I can sit here and say very confidently, Wilson got it wrong. Whooping cough vaccine does not cause neurological problems of any sort. But Now, in Japan, where the scare had spread to, the scare did spread to Japan, and Yuji Sato of the Japanese National Institutes of Health took a different approach. His view was, well, maybe the issue is that we're injecting the whole killed bacterium. That's simply a lot of different proteins. Maybe we don't need to inject all of them. And maybe, and of course, he was looking at this in the 1980s, that this was 50 years on from Kendrick's time. Maybe the biotechnology of the 1980s could come up with a more refined vaccine. And he came up with the acellular vaccine, which has only between 3 and 6 proteins derived from the whooping cough bacterium. It causes the side effects it causes are much lower. It doesn't give the same sort of fevers and diarrhea that you get from the Kendrick's whole cell Michigan method vaccine. And it became the vaccine of choice in high income countries. In fact, it replaced the Michigan method vaccine in Britain in 2004. If you've received a whooping cough vaccine in the last 20 years, you will have got some variant of Sato's acellular vaccine. As I say, the side effects are not as bad, but unfortunately, it's not quite as effective. We do see more breakthrough cases with people who've received that vaccine, although they tend not to be very serious cases of whooping cough. This whole episode galvanized the anti-vaccine movement into the popular movement that we recognize today. Now, in those early days, through the 1980s, early 1990s, it was, as far as I can make out, a movement of mostly well-intentioned people, consumer activists and concerned parents. Nobody was really making any money out of it, except possibly a few lawyers chasing speculative lawsuits, until in 1998 along came this wazzock. A man whose name should always be written in Comic Sans and whose picture should always be placed next to the cover of the book that detailed the investigation exposing him as a fraud. Now, as you're probably aware, this is the man who said that the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, MMR vaccine, causes autism. It does not. Thanks to Brian Deer, we know that Wakefield falsified his results. We also know that much is well known. What's less well known is that, and is covered by Deer's book, is that while this was going on, Wakefield was setting himself as the director of several startup biotech companies, which were funded largely from within the anti-vaccine movement. Some of them were what we call crowdfunded these days, what we might call crowdfunding now. Some of them were paid for by certain particularly wealthy donors. They were all supposedly coming up with various outlandish products that were supposed to diagnose or prevent or cure autism, none of which saw the light of day. But while he was presenting himself as a director of these companies, he was paying himself a nice salary as the company, as he was paying himself a nice salary for doing that. He had pioneered the art, or dare I say, the grift of monetizing the anti-vaccine movement. And where Wakefield led, many others have followed. It's now become a solid marketing strategy that's used for alternate medicines or actually for populist politicians, not least by a fellow you might have heard of called Donald Trump, whose personal fortune is drawn from a life insurance payout that his father got when his grandfather died during the 1918 influenza epidemic. If only there'd been a decent vaccine against influenza back then. But that's not the thought I'm going to leave you with. I'm going to come back to some of the successes we've seen with the whooping cough vaccine, because in 1980, most children in high and middle income countries were at least being offered whooping cough vaccine. There was this is the throes of the scare, so they weren't all getting it. But at that point, there was an initiative to make this vaccine available throughout the world and to make it available in low income countries where it hadn't been affordable before that. Now, that figure on the right shows the results of that. The blue and the red lines are estimates for how many children were being vaccinated. And we can see it climbs from about 30% in 1980 to about 80% by 1990, and it kept climbing. It's sort of between 85 and 90% now. And we can see the results. The number of cases worldwide dropped from around 2 million in 1980 to about 500,000 by 1990, and it kept falling. It's now at around 100,000 a year. Too many, really, but a lot less, far fewer than there used to be. Now, I said I wasn't going to throw too many figures at you, but this figure illustrates why scientists like me often get quite excited about figures, because all that white space on that figure is children not getting whooping cough. And because the starting point is where we were when it was only children in low income countries who weren't getting it, that's children not getting it in low income countries, where many of them would not be able to access decent health care if they got it, where 1 in 50 of them would still die of whooping cough. Only they're not getting it. They're not getting whooping cough because they're being vaccinated, and the vaccine they're getting is in fact a variant of Kendrick's Michigan method vaccine, which is still the vaccine of choice in low-income countries, because you don't want breakthrough infections where you can't be sure of getting decent health care. Kendrick is memorialized with a statue in Grand Rapids. We can see her there, flanked by Grace Eldering and Loney Gordon, and facing two very healthy-looking children who obviously don't have whooping cough. She went on to be a professor in the Michigan University School of Public Health. And I'd like to leave the last word to the dean of that school, who said, Dr. Kendrick never became rich and outside a relatively small circle of informed friends and colleagues, never became famous. All she did was save hundreds of thousands of lives. Now, the figure on that page tells us that's out of date. We should now say she saved millions of lives. And when people like me, and possibly like some of you, get involved in medical research, that's the sort of thing that we'd all like to have somebody say about us one day, and very few of us ever achieve that. Pearl Kendrick did achieve that, and she did it with no funding at all, working her evenings and weekends with the people who gave up their time and their money to help her. And that is the thought I would like to leave you with. Thank you very much.
Thanks indeed, David. Absolutely fascinating story that was totally worthy of being retold. So thanks again for that. I'm sure it's provoked a lot of thoughts and questions in our audience this evening. So I'd welcome everyone to now start posting your questions on the Q&A that you can find at the bottom of your webinar screen. David, if I could maybe just start off the questioning. How can we potentially make the acellular whooping cough vaccine more effective but still retain safety, do you think? Is that feasible?
There are quite a lot of people working on improved whooping cough vaccines that would achieve that. Actually, I think the solution may be going in the other direction, because it seems like it's relatively few components of the wholesale vaccines that are causing the potential the nasty fevers and so on. And if they can be removed from the wholesale vaccine, then you'd have something that's still as effective. The problem that they're running into is simply funding. A lot of the people that come up with this stuff see whooping cough as a solved problem. There is, I don't know if you've probably heard the term, the biomedical valley of death, which is you get your product to a certain level and then you need a large amount of funding to do a large scale trial, usually in the terms of hundreds of millions of dollars, and you just can't find that. And there are quite a lot of potential whooping cough vaccines sitting in the bottom of that valley of death at the moment.
And the compromise that we've come up with in the UK, of course, is that we're now offering the vaccine to mums in third trimester of their pregnancy.
Well, I mean, that's not so much a compromise bit of effectiveness. I mean, it's because that boosts their own antibody response, which is then passed on to the fetus. And the idea is really to give the child protection until they get their first whooping cough vaccine, which does seem to be a reasonably effective approach. And the problem we've got is uptake of that is about 60% at the moment, which means there's about 40% of children who are vulnerable until they get their first vaccine. And I mean, with uptake of childhood vaccines is over 90%. So it's not that people object to vaccines on principle. I'm not quite sure why that's falling down quite as much.
Okay. So taking your first question then from our audience, how would Kendrick have obtained consent from parents for the injection? I guess it raises
Well, she probably would have asked. Again, it's not really recorded then because, well, it's not. It was not the ethic. Well, actually a whole other fascinating story about how we got to where we are now around the ethics of medical research, which was just not really seen as particularly important back then. Different individuals had different degrees of um, care, if you like. I mean, it's not likely that she would have just marched in there and started vaccinating children without asking the parents. Of course, we did see in the 50s and 60s a lot of unfortunately a lot of vaccines being tested on children in children's homes because it was much easier to get consent and you didn't have to argue with parents at that point. And Kendrick obviously wasn't doing that, but there probably would not have been a process of informed, as complicated a process of, well, no, there definitely wouldn't have been the process of informed consent that we have to go through now.
Yeah. Yeah. How has the technology for creating vaccines advanced? Because the COVID vaccines
Mm.
were certainly made very quickly compared to other vaccines.
Um, yeah, well, there have been a massive number of advances in sorry, I'm trying to think of a short answer to that question because it's actually a very big question. Um, the I would say that the really big advances that led us up to the COVID vaccine was an understanding of um, simply how the genetics of viruses work. That you can put the gene of a virus induces viral proteins, which are then picked up by the cell and presented to the immune system. And it's ways of finding a short way of doing that you can use as a vaccine. Um, in a lot of cases, that simply meant culturing a virus until it wasn't that pathogenic anymore, or hoping it wasn't that pathogenic anymore, which is how we get the measles and mumps vaccine. The COVID vaccines came through a process of really trying to co-opt that process with recombinant vaccine, where an existing virus was pulled apart and turned into a delivery mechanism for the protein that we want, or mRNA vaccines, which don't even bother using another virus. They just inject the genes that you want directly into a cell to effectively do the bit of the process that induces the immune response. Um, and I should say that that technology was developed in the years running up to the COVID-19 pandemic. In a way, we got sort of lucky because at the point that COVID-19 appeared, there were two vaccine technologies that used those approaches, both of them looking for an application. And my God, did they get one?
So are we likely to see further use of these technologies in terms of potentially producing vaccines against other pathogens in coming years?
We're already seeing well, I know the Oxford group that produced the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine have several others on the go. I spoke to Kath Green a few months back, and she was very excited. So they're about to start trials for a new rabies vaccine that could be used in low income, specifically aimed at low income countries, using a very similar technology to the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine.
Yeah.
mRNA vaccines certainly have a lot of potential. Why where things are with that, I'm not entirely sure at the moment, so I don't want to speculate too much because I'm not up to speed with that. But
It probably means that if when and if
mm,
SARS-CoV-3 comes along, we're in a much better position to respond, I guess, with
one
the
hopes, yeah, yeah. I mean, the problem, of course, with these new applications is exactly the same as what I was talking with the whooping cough vaccine, is that somebody somewhere has to pony up a very large amount of money to do a proper trial before we can use the vaccine. Is that's often the difficult bit with these things.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, I guess a
Mm,
related question: what
mm.
challenges do you think we face now in finding new vaccines?
Yeah, it's another one of these questions. Um, I think the biggest challenge we've got is that most of the microbes where it's relatively easy to come up with a vaccine for, we already have a vaccine for them.
Yeah,
We're now dealing with the difficult ones. Now, of course, there are exceptions to that, which is the ones um, um, that suddenly emerge unexpectedly, which does happen periodically. Um, but yeah, a lot of the ones that we're dealing with now, for example, there's a ongoing initiative to come up with a better vaccine against tuberculosis than the BCG vaccine, which is, I mean, it's got some effectiveness, but it's not a particularly good vaccine.
Yeah.
Also against HIV, of course, has been one that's defeated vaccine developers for about 40 years now. The reason is that these are pathogens that are very, very good at evading the immune system, and vaccination works by inducing the immune system. But if the immune system can't catch them, as it were,
Yeah.
then vaccination as an approach is not going to work. So there is a question about, is it actually even possible to come up with a working vaccine there, or do we need to come up with something else?
Yeah. And I guess there's always concern around the next influenza pandemic and
Yeah.
whether we can come up with a vaccine that's universal that would, then protect against all variants.
Yeah. I mean, universal influenza vaccine, it's another one of these things that's been, everybody's been aiming to do that for years. Um, I think it would be possible to come up with a vaccine that's at least covers a very broad range of influenza, possible influenza types, which would mean that we're covered against all the seasonal influenzas going around and any pandemic influenza that's likely to happen.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. No, I mean, I don't want to be too, because of course the malaria vaccine was something that for a long time when I was in medical research, it was always just going to be a few years away. And I think a lot of people just rolling their eyes and saying, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then of course last year we got it and it's now being rolled out. So, the fact that these things are being difficult and they're a long time in the future doesn't mean that they're impossible and they won't happen sometime.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't want to sound too negative about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm,
So, the big question then that a couple of people have posed here is, what do you think the effect of that Donald Trump could have on research and vaccinations during his next presidency? Donald Trump has suggested pre-election that vaccines could be banned.
mm.
What are your opinions on this in terms of whooping cough? Do you believe it would lead to a worldwide epidemic if over half of Americans decided not to vaccinate their children due to political views?
Well, it won't lead to a worldwide epidemic because if you remember, I said that whooping cough is in fact always circulating. I mean, the vaccination doesn't stop whooping cough circulating. So as long as anybody who's vaccinated is going to be infected with it from time to time, and the fact that there might be a big pool of people in America spreading it around the world isn't going to change that situation fundamentally. It will be very bad for America. Um, I'd be more worried about, I'm actually more worried about America becoming a center for disinformation, which I mean does tend to happen with the anti-vaccine movement, in that a lot of the scares, I mean, for example, John Wilson and Andrew Wakefield were both British and they both initiated vaccine scares, but they went really big when they went to America. Um, and now we've got a Kennedy on board with the anti-vaccine scares.
So,
That's the part of it I'd be most worried about.
yeah. So how do we counter, this
Mm.
this movement? Do you think? What's
I wish I knew the answer to that. I I mean, I try and do my bit simply by producing good information, but of course, we all know that that doesn't really work to somebody who's already committed to bad information, and with very high profile people shouting about vaccines being dangerous. Um, yeah, I think all we can really do is I think passing good information around is about all we can do, really, because I can't see how else to go about it. And there are people who are doing this much more effectively than I am. I hasten to add. I mean, I usually talk to groups like this, where I think I'm probably mostly talking to people who are already on board with it.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Thanks, David. How are vaccines created, and how do scientists figure out what components will work within the vaccine?
Ooh, um, that's another enormous question because there's no single way of doing that. And the way new vaccines are created is actually very different to the way that a lot of the vaccines we're still using were created and developed using the biotech of bygone eras, but we're still using them because we know they work. Um, we're still using fundamentally the same yellow fever vaccine that a group of scientists came up with in the 1930s, when they only had a vague idea of what a virus was.
Yeah.
Whereas now, yes, I mean, there is a lot of doing the technique that was actually in a way pioneered by Yuji Sato when he came up with the acellular vaccine, of trying to work out. We know that the immune response responds to protein molecules, so it's trying to work out what protein molecule induces an effective immune response. What does an effective immune response look like, and then how can we package that into a vaccine? That's the big picture. The processes are obviously far more complex than that, and tend to be specific to get, there are a lot of different ways of going about that.
Yes. David, we've talked about vaccines in the context of infectious disease this evening, but there's a lot of interest in developing vaccines against Alzheimer's. Someone's asking here,
Yeah.
cancer, maybe obesity. What can you say about those kinds of vaccines?
Well, it's the fundamental process that what a vaccine does is it induces an immune response against a protein. And if, for example, you have a cancer that is expressing a particular protein that's only expressed by those cancer cells, then inducing an immune response against that protein would be very effective at getting rid of the cancer. I think the tau protein that causes Alzheimer's. I'm less clear how vaccines are supposed to work against obesity. I think that's I'm just not up to speed with that research. Yeah, I think this is one of the big new things that's going on in research at the moment, is using vaccines as a therapy rather than as a preventative, and
Yes.
using them against these conditions that are not actually infectious diseases.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, it's encouraging. We're certainly seeing some pretty good results from some of these vaccines. As far as I can make out, the anti-cancer ones are more life extending than curing cancer, but well, we live in hope.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, should an adult take a whooping cough vaccine if not pregnant?
I mean, I'm not medically qualified, so this comes with the caveat that this is not medical advice. Um, I would say that because we're all infected with it every few years anyway, and whenever we're infected, we do get a kick. That it does give our immune system a kick in the backside. Um, I probably isn't a lot of value to it, and also, I mean, we have seen, in fact, over the last year, we've seen a whooping cough outbreak in Britain that's actually killed 10 children. I think they were all unvaccinated, but it's the first time it's been in double figures for more than 10 years. But we're not seeing a lot of cases in adults.
No.
Um,
As long as you've had the vaccine, it'll
yeah.
prevent any serious disease.
Yeah, I should say that if you're an adult, you don't want to get it as an adult, an unvaccinated adult. It can be extreme. I mean, there are plenty of cases of it inducing coughing so violent that people just break ribs through the coughing.
Yeah.
I have to say, until I started looking into whooping cough, I didn't know you could cough so violently that you can break your own ribs. But whooping cough can do that to people. And of course, you're then continuing to cough with a broken rib, which is so. Yeah, if you haven't been vaccinated, then you certainly want to get vaccinated. But if you have been, then you're probably okay.
Um,
Yeah.
Perhaps one last question,
Mm,
David, given the time
mm, mm.
constraints. What advice should we be giving to anxious parents whose child is about to receive their first vaccines? So
Um,
what would be the take-home message to assuage, a concerned parent, would you say?
I think that in that case, the best thing to do would, if somebody's having that conversation, the best thing to do is make sure you have a set of facts at your fingertips, and then just ask what their concerns are.
Mhm.
Because actually, there's a lot of people and a lot of parents who have genuine, reasonable questions to which there are genuine, reasonable answers. Um, and would rather have that conversation than simply telling them don't listen to what you read online, because um, that's not the issue. That's generally, I think most people do know that. And I think a lot of the anxiety around vaccination simply comes from the fact that somebody's then got to sit there and watch a needle being stuck into their child, which is upsetting for most parents. And I think it is worth acknowledging that.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I think dialogue and listening is the bit that
And,
often gets missed out.
and transparency, as you say, in terms.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
David, thanks once again for a really outstanding lecture this evening. I'm sure our audience have very much appreciated tuning in this evening.